Rain washed over the steps of St. Mercy General Hospital as if trying to cleanse it of the years of whispered tragedies that clung to its walls. The building rose like a stern, unblinking sentinel in the storm, its windows dim, its corridors humming with a quiet, unnatural tension. For most of the city, St. Mercy was just an aging hospital that handled too many emergencies and not enough miracles. But for those who worked the night shift, it was something else entirely. They spoke in low voices about the deaths that never quite made sense, patients who were stable one moment and gone the next, their bodies cold long before they should have been. 213 victims in 16 years, all brushed aside with the same explanation: complications. The discovery of the first pattern didn't come from an official investigation or a senior doctor with decades of experience, but from a tired intern named Adrian Cole, who had been working double shifts for nearly a month. He had no reason to believe anything was wrong when he was assigned to reorganize old patient files, no reason to think the thick binder of death reports he carried into the dimly lit records room would change his understanding of St. Mercy General forever. The task was mundane, the kind given to someone too new to question it and too exhausted to complain. Yet as he sifted through the paperwork under the weak glow of a flickering bulb, something began to tug at the edges of his attention. It started with a single file, then another, and then another, dates, times, and notes that shouldn't have aligned but did, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for years waiting for someone to finally notice them. Each file listed a death that was chalked up to unpredictable clinical decline, the kind of phrase hospitals used when there was no better explanation. But what unsettled Adrian wasn't the wording, it was the timestamp printed in the corner of every report. 2:47 a.m. The exact time of the final heart monitor alert. The moment the patient was discovered unresponsive. The instant the quiet shift fractured into panic. It struck him as coincidence at first. Hospitals had rhythms, and night shifts were notoriously difficult. Maybe it was simply the hour when overstressed bodies gave out. That was what he told himself as he set aside the first 3 files, but the thought stayed with him like a shadow clinging to his heels. When he pulled the next handful of records, his fingers trembled slightly as he checked the times. 2:50 a.m., 2:47 a.m., 3:03 a.m. A cluster locked within the same narrow slice of night. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, and checked again. Not a single death occurred outside that window during any early morning shift for more than a decade, not among the unexplained ones. The realization settled into him slowly, coldly, like water rising around his ankles. He felt the air in the records room grow denser, the walls pressing in as if the hospital itself didn't want him to continue reading. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe nightly rounds happened at that time, and the hospital only logged discoveries then. Maybe that was when the few nurses on duty did their checks. But even that made no sense. Each report listed the time of death, not the time of discovery. The distinction was clear in every single file, noted by precise handwriting, pulse charts, and device readouts that all aligned far too perfectly. It wasn't just a pattern. It was deliberate in its consistency, and the more he flipped through the pages, the more he felt as though something unseen was staring back at him from between the lines. Adrian remembered overhearing hushed conversations in the break room, nurses whispering about how the nights felt heavier around 3 in the morning, how the air turned cold no matter how high the heaters were set, how machines acted strangely for a few minutes before resetting on their own. He had dismissed those comments then as the stress-fueled exaggerations of overworked staff. But now, with the files laid out before him, those whispers took on a new and terrifying clarity. He thought back to how the senior night nurse, a woman who had seen more tragedies than anyone else on staff, always avoided being alone in the East Wing between 2:30 and 3 a.m. She had never explained why. She didn't need to. Fear spoke for her in the way she clutched her clipboard tighter, in the quick glances she threw toward the darkened hall whenever she passed it. Adrian's breath hitched as he found the oldest report in the pile, a death from 16 years earlier, the first unexplained case. Even then, when the building had been newer and the staff larger, the time was the same. 2:47 a.m. He imagined that night all those years ago, the ward silent except for the occasional beep of machinery and the soft shoes of nurses gliding down polished floors. Some patients surrounded by sterile walls and dim lights, perhaps asleep, perhaps awake and staring into the hollow corners of the room, unaware that something was approaching. That idea sank claws into Adrian's mind. What could move through the hospital without being seen, without leaving marks, without triggering alarms, yet stay perfectly aligned with the clock? His pulse quickened, and he felt the weight of the building shift, as though St. Mercy itself sensed his intrusion. The walls, with their pale paint and aging tiles, seemed to pulse faintly with an unseen heartbeat he had never noticed before. The hum of the overhead lights deepened, stretching into a low vibration that thrummed through his bones. He pressed a hand against the table to steady himself, but even the metal felt colder now, as if touched by the remnants of every patient who had passed through these corridors and never left. He gathered the records into a stack, intending to show someone, anyone, but the moment he stood, he paused. A strange silence settled over the room. The building's usual nighttime murmurs, the distant rattle of vents, the soft shuffle of carts, the muffled conversations, fell away one by one, until all that remained was the faint clicking of the clock mounted above the doorway. The second hand moved with a steady rhythm, uncaring, unhurried, ticking its way toward 2:47 a.m. Adrian looked at the stack of files, then back at the clock, and felt a cold certainty twist in his gut. This was not coincidence, nor error, nor a trick of an overworked mind. Something happened at that exact time, something that St. Mercy General had been hiding for 16 long years, and whether he liked it or not, Adrian had just stepped onto a path that wouldn't let him turn back. Ward C had always been part of the hospital's whispered lore, a forbidden wing spoken of the way children speak of places they dare each other to touch but never enter. Officially, it had been under renovation for more than a decade, though no construction crews ever came, no materials were delivered, and no funding was ever allocated. The door remained locked, its narrow window blocked by layers of peeling tape and dust that seemed older than the notice stuck to it. Staff avoided walking past it unless absolutely necessary, and even then they quickened their pace, as if the air outside the door were thinner, colder, or somehow hungry. For new hires, Ward C was a curiosity. For those who had worked at St. Mercy long enough, it was a line they did not cross, a boundary the hospital itself seemed determined to keep intact. The first time Adrian passed the sealed wing after discovering the death pattern, he felt the hairs on his arms rise despite the warmth of the hallway. Something about the stretch of corridor before Ward C felt different from the rest of the hospital. The lights there flickered more often, buzzing with a sharp, agitated hum. The paint seemed darker, as if stained by shadows that clung no matter how much cleaner was used. Even the air tasted metallic, like the afterbite of blood lingering on the tongue. He had walked past it many times during his shift, but now, with the unsettling puzzle still fresh in his mind, he found himself staring at the bolted door for longer than usual. It wasn't that he expected something to move behind the window, it was the sense that something already was. Nurses often swapped stories about the noises, soft rustling, faint dragging sounds, an occasional tapping that echoed through the hallway long after the rest of the building had quieted. The sound wasn't constant, but came at unpredictable intervals, like an animal stirring in its sleep. Some said they heard breathing, steady and deep, as if someone stood just on the other side of the door. Others swore they saw the sign sway even when the air was completely still. When asked who oversaw the renovation project, no administrator ever gave a straight answer. The few who pressed the question found their schedules abruptly changed or their access levels reassigned, and eventually they stopped asking. The more Adrian listened to the rumors, the more he sensed the staff's fear wasn't exaggerated. It was carefully controlled, like a fire kept small to keep it from burning out of control. One night, around 3 a.m., a janitor named Rosalie confessed something after he helped her pick up a spilled bucket of supplies. With trembling hands, she told him she had once forgotten her mop cart outside Ward C and returned minutes later to find every item on it rearranged, neatly, intentionally, as if someone had taken careful time to handle each object. She had been alone in the corridor. There had been no footsteps. No voices. No one else had passed through that wing. She'd taken her cart and never returned to that hallway again unless called. Even more disturbing were the sudden fluctuations in temperature. Those who walked past the door reported feeling the temperature drop sharply, cold enough for their breath to fog despite the hallway thermostats reading normal levels. Technicians who recalibrated the sensors insisted nothing was wrong with the equipment, and yet anyone who stepped into the stretch of corridor just before the door felt a chill seep into their bones. The cold wasn't external, it felt internal, creeping from the spine outward. What unsettled Adrian most was the knowledge that Ward C had once been a fully operating wing. Older nurses remembered its rooms, its patients, the quiet hum of daily routines. Then one night, 16 years ago, the entire ward was abruptly closed after an incident that no one could clearly describe. The staff on duty at the time either quit soon after or transferred to other hospitals with little explanation. Rumors swirled, strange screams, malfunctioning equipment, a power surge that had wiped out the entire electrical grid on that floor. One account claimed that a patient had disappeared from a locked room, leaving only blooded sheets behind, though no body was ever found. Another whispered tale spoke of a doctor who locked himself inside the wing before it was sealed, insisting he had to stay with whatever they had awakened. The administration publicly denied every story, but offered no alternative explanation. Adrian tried to piece together what he could from archived documents, but most of the reports from that period were missing or heavily redacted. Entire pages had been removed. Dates didn't line up. Signatures were blacked out. It was as though someone had carefully scrubbed every trace of Ward C's past, leaving only the hollow shell of the wing itself as evidence of something deeply wrong. The more he searched, the more he felt that the sealed wing wasn't merely abandoned, it was hiding something. Or worse, it was containing it. Late one evening, as he walked past the restricted corridor alone, Adrian paused again outside the door. His flashlight flickered even though the batteries were new. The thin metal frame of the door rattled softly, though there was no draft. He leaned closer, listening. At first he heard nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Then, faintly, something brushed against the other side of the door, slow, deliberate, as though dragging across the floor. A soft scraping sound moved toward him, stopped just inches from where he stood, then tapped once. The sound was light, but purposeful, as if acknowledging him. Adrian stepped back, heart pounding, convinced for the first time that the pattern of deaths, the missing files, the hushed staff, and this sealed, forgotten wing were all threads of the same buried truth. He didn't know what waited behind Ward C's locked doors, but he felt with chilling certainty that it was not asleep, not gone, and not finished with St. Mercy General, or with anyone who dared to notice it. The woman's return from death did not begin with a miracle. It began with a scream, raw, animal, and filled with a terror so pure that the night staff froze as if the sound had pinned them in place. Her name was Marlene Havers, a 64-year-old patient admitted for a mild cardiac arrhythmia. Stable. Calm. Speaking with her daughter only hours before. Her chart suggested no sign of decline, and yet, at exactly 2:53 a.m., her heart monitor flatlined with a sudden jolt that startled the nurse on duty. The code team rushed in, performed every maneuver with precision born of repetition, but nothing revived her. The time of death was logged. The machines were shut off. Her body was prepared for transfer. Everyone accepted the loss because in St. Mercy, unexplained death had become routine. But the moment the stretcher carrying Marlene rolled into the subdued, chilled hall leading toward the morgue, everything changed. The orderly pushing the gurney felt it first, a faint vibration through the metal rails, like fingers tapping from the inside. He paused, thinking it was his imagination, but then the tapping grew into a frantic rhythm. Before he could call for help, Marlene's entire body convulsed, arching upward with a sickening crack of stiffened joints. Her eyes snapped open, wide and wild, pupils dilated so far they swallowed the color entirely. She let out a scream that echoed off the sterile tiles and into the hollow belly of the hospital. She clawed at the air as if fighting something invisible, her hand swiping at her own chest, her neck, her face. The orderly stumbled back in horror, knocking over a tray of instruments that clattered and rolled across the floor. Nurses came running, alarms blaring, lights flickering overhead as though the building were reacting to her resurrection. Marlene's voice ripped through the corridor with a desperation that bordered on madness. "Don't let him near me again," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Don't let him touch me." Her words repeated like a mantra, each utterance more frantic than the last. The staff tried to calm her, restrain her, comfort her, but she recoiled from every hand that reached out, shrieking that it wasn't them she feared. She wasn't looking at the faces around her, she was staring past them, into the empty corners of the ceiling, the shadowed seams between walls, the stretch of hallway behind the group where no one stood. Her eyes tracked something none of them could see. When doctors finally sedated her, her body collapsed into a trembling stillness, though even under the haze of drugs, her lips continued to form the same whisper. Again. And again. Don't let him near me. The incident was reported to the administration, who reacted with swift, suffocating control. Every staff member present was required to sign a confidentiality agreement. The official explanation declared her spontaneous recovery a rare but documented phenomenon. The screams, they insisted, were the result of oxygen deprivation and disorientation. But the staff knew better. Marlene hadn't screamed like someone confused. She screamed like someone who had seen something waiting for her in the dark. Adrian learned of the event the following morning, long after the corridor had returned to its practiced stillness. Whispers circulated through the break room, fragments of a story pieced together by frightened voices. He sought the orderly who had transported Marlene, but the man had already been reassigned to another wing and refused to speak beyond a single, shaken sentence: she wasn't dead, but she wasn't alive either. Marlene's room was guarded for the rest of the night. Nurses reported strange fluctuations in the readings of machines not connected to her. Lights dimmed in her room when every other hallway remained bright. One monitor flickered with static, showing what looked like a shadow standing beside her bed, though the staff dismissed it as a glitch. The temperature in the room sank so low that one nurse saw her breath plume before her eyes, and though she complained repeatedly, maintenance found nothing wrong with the ventilation system. Adrian visited her chart later in the day, curiosity clawing at him. Her medical notes described her revival in sanitized, almost robotic language, as though the writer had been struggling to erase their own terror while documenting the event. Buried in the notes was the most chilling line of all: patient reports vivid recollection of being conscious during flatline. Patient claims presence in room during death. But the physician who wrote the report had stopped there, offering no detail, no follow-up. It was as if they feared putting more into writing. Against better judgment, Adrian decided he needed to hear the rest from Marlene herself. He approached her room during visiting hours, slipping in with the softest possible knock. The lights were dimmed, the blinds half drawn. Marlene lay awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling with an expression caught between dread and paralysis. When he stepped closer, she turned her gaze toward him with the slow, mechanical movement of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. He asked her gently what had happened. She flinched at the question, fingers tightening around the thin fabric of her blanket. For several seconds she said nothing, as though weighing whether speaking might invite whatever haunted her back into the room. When she finally answered, her voice was a whisper barely stronger than breath. "He was there," she said. "In the corner. Watching." Adrian followed her gaze to the empty corner of the room. Shadows pooled there, thick and unmoving. He waited, she continued, her eyes filling with tears. "Waited until they left me alone. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. And when he touched me, she shuddered. It was cold. So cold it burned." She said she had felt her heart stop, felt the world go distant, felt herself sinking into a darkness thick and suffocating. But she had not been alone in it. Something had followed her down. Something that had no face, no voice, but eyes she could feel more than see. When her heart restarted, she said she heard him whisper, though she refused to repeat the words. She only said that the moment she returned, she realized he wasn't trapped in the dark. He had been in St. Mercy all along. The staff believed she had lost her mind. Adrian knew she had lost something else, something vital, something the hospital had taken from 213 others who never came back to speak. Only Marlene had crawled back across the threshold, carrying a warning that no one wanted to hear but no one could ignore. The deeper Adrian dug into St. Mercy's history, the more he felt the ground beneath the hospital shift, not literally, but in the way old lies began to peel back like rotting floorboards, revealing something festering underneath. He hadn't intended to become an investigator, but every answer he found led to more questions, and those questions clung to him long after he left the building each night. He started requesting access to old archives under the guise of updating digital records, a task no administrator questioned because no one else wanted to spend hours combing through decades of paperwork. But the more files he opened, the more he realized entire years of records had been deliberately shredded, redacted, or moved. Not misfiled, removed with surgical precision, leaving behind empty folders and incomplete logs that hinted at a truth someone desperately wanted erased. It began with the hospital board's minutes from 16 years ago, the year the first unexplained death occurred. The folders were intact, but the pages inside were gone, leaving behind rust-colored paperclips and faint indentations where typed words once Saturday. In the maintenance logs, Adrian found a strange anomaly, a week-long shutdown of the electrical grid on the east side, listed without explanation or follow-up documentation. A shutdown of that size would have caused mass chaos, yet there were no incident reports, no logged staff complaints, nothing to show that it had ever happened except the single line in the maintenance book someone forgot to erase. He dug deeper. The patient census for that same period showed a sudden, dramatic drop of nearly 30 admitted individuals. Not transferred. Not discharged. Simply missing from the records as if they had evaporated. He checked local obituary archives and confirmed that none of those names appeared in public death notices. They had been wiped from existence, leaving only faint pencil marks where they once had been recorded. When Adrian brought the anomalies to a senior nurse he trusted, her face went pale. Instead of answering, she quietly shut the folder and told him never to bring those files onto the floor again. Her reaction was not confusion or disbelief, it was fear, heavy and practiced, the fear of someone who knew the consequences of asking the wrong questions. The more Adrian searched, the more certain he became that St. Mercy had buried something catastrophic. But what unsettled him most was not the missing data, it was the strange, recurring phrase he kept finding scribbled in the margins of old reports. Different handwriting styles. Different staff members. Different years. But always the same three words, it happened again. Sometimes the phrase stood alone, scrawled hurriedly as though written in panic. Other times it was attached to charts that looked perfectly routine until he realized they were the ones whose patients died at the same impossible hour. Each note felt like a cry from someone who wanted to warn the future but was silenced before they could speak out loud. His search eventually led him to the hospital's oldest surviving physician, Dr. Edwin Mallory, a man whose presence in St. Mercy stretched back to when the building was still considered modern. Mallory had recently retired, but he still came in twice a week to complete administrative tasks, drifting through the halls like a ghost who refused to leave. Adrian found him in his tiny office, surrounded by dusty diplomas and books with cracked spines. When he asked about the missing files, Mallory paused, the pen in his hand hovering in midair as if frozen by an invisible force. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, it was with the weariness of someone carrying a truth too heavy to hold. "There are things about this hospital you should leave alone," Mallory murmured without looking up from his desk. "Things better forgotten." Adrian pressed on, asking about the unexplained deaths, the year Ward C was sealed, the vanished patients. Mallory's jaw tightened. His eye shifted toward the door, checking whether anyone might overhear. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed that 16 years ago an internal investigation had taken place, one that never made it into public record, one that most of the staff never even knew existed. According to Mallory, the board had discovered irregularities not only in patient outcomes but in staff behavior, particularly among the overnight medical team assigned to Ward C. Nurses claimed they were seeing figures standing in rooms that were supposed to be empty. Doctors reported sudden losses of consciousness while charting. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that defied explanation, and several patients reported waking in the night unable to move, feeling a cold presence sitting on their chest. When Adrian asked what the investigators concluded, Mallory shook his head. "There was no conclusion," he said. "Just fear. And silence." The official recommendation, Mallory explained, was to shut down Ward C entirely, to seal it and scatter its staff across the building. But shutting down the wing did nothing to stop the deaths. Whatever haunted that place did not stay locked behind a single door. Adrian left Mallory's office with a sense of dread gnawing at his chest. If the internal investigation had been buried, if the staff had been silenced, if so much of the hospital's past had been erased, then he knew he was far closer to the truth than anyone wanted him to be. The hospital was not haunted by coincidence, nor cursed by faulty equipment. It was haunted by something St. Mercy had once tried to confront, failed to understand, and ultimately chose to imprison. But prisons do not always hold what they are built to contain, and Adrian could feel that whatever had once been trapped behind Ward C's sealed door had long since seeped into the veins of the hospital itself. Every hallway felt tighter now. Every shadow seemed deeper. And the clock on the wall outside the records room, old, tarnished, and barely functioning, ticked in a rhythm that made his skin crawl. The hands moved toward the familiar hour, and with each passing second he felt more certain he was running out of time to uncover the truth before the truth finally noticed him. Adrian didn't plan to be on duty the night everything aligned again, but fate, or something far darker, had arranged it that way. He felt it the moment he entered the hospital at dusk, the way the air tightened as though the building had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe out. The fluorescent lights flickered with a steadiness that didn't feel accidental, and the shadows pooling along the corners seemed to stretch just slightly farther than they should have, as if reaching for him. By now he had become attuned to St. Mercy's unnatural rhythms, the strange pulse that ran through its corridors like a heartbeat no one acknowledged. And that night, everything felt wrong. Unsettled. Waiting. It began with a power flutter. A quick, almost hesitant flick of the lights that sent a murmur through the halls. Machines beeped in confusion. The ventilation paused for a moment, then resumed with a low, guttural growl that none of the staff commented on but all of them heard. It was 2:40 a.m., the window of time he had come to dread. 213 deaths in 16 years, all within the same small slice of the night. He had double-checked the charts earlier in the shift and found 2 patients marked as high risk, both stable but vulnerable. He had stationed himself as close to their rooms as possible, refusing to let the hour pass without witnessing whatever force had stalked so many before them. At 2:46 a.m., the first sign arrived, a sudden, bone-deep chill that swept down the entire west corridor, strong enough to make the temperature sensors blink with error codes. Nurses rubbed their arms and muttered about the broken heating system. One even fetched a portable space heater, but moments after plugging it in, the device sparked and died with a burst of static. Adrian felt the cold seep into his bones, settling in his spine like a hand pressing inward. The hallway lights dimmed slightly, not flickering, not failing, just lowering, as if something fed on their brightness. Then the noises started. Not loud, not obvious, but a faint, rhythmic dragging coming from somewhere distant. It sounded like fabric sliding across tile. Or feet that didn't lift when stepping. The sound grew slowly, like something approaching with deliberate patience. Adrian looked down the hallway and saw nothing but the stretch of sterile walls and muted light. Yet the sound continued, echoing softly, increasing in clarity with each second. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as the lights flickered again, this time syncing with the slow, advancing scrape. He moved toward room 317, one of the high-risk patients, but stopped after only a few steps. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, half shrouded in shadow despite the overhead lights. Adrian blinked, unsure if his eyes were betraying him. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, didn't breathe. It was just there, tall, thin, impossibly still. The lights around it dimmed more than the rest of the hall, as though its presence pulled brightness toward itself and swallowed it. Adrian forced himself to walk forward, each step heavy, as though wading through thick, invisible resistance. But with every step, the figure seemed to blur, its edges softening like smoke dissolving in air. When he finally reached the end of the hallway, the figure had vanished, but the dragging sound continued, now behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, but the hall was empty again. The cold grew sharper, the kind of cold that belonged not to malfunctioning heaters but to something far older, deeper, and more intentional. He hurried toward the patient rooms, and as he passed 315, the door slammed shut with a force that cracked the wooden frame. A nurse screamed from around the corner. Alarms erupted in a staggered pattern, not all at once, but in a sequence that felt like footsteps approaching from every direction. Adrian reached room 317 just as the monitor flatlined. The patient, a man recovering from a bypass procedure, lay absolutely still, eyes open, staring upward with a frozen expression of terror. Adrian checked for a pulse, for breath, for any sign of life, but his skin was already cold, too cold for someone whose heart had stopped mere seconds earlier. The air in the room felt thick, heavy enough to choke on. Shadows clung unnaturally to the corners, and for a moment, Adrian thought he saw movement, a shift in darkness, like something withdrawing from the patient's bed. He stepped back, pulse hammering in his ears, and the dragging noise started again, closer this time, so close he could almost feel it brushing against his legs. He turned, expecting to see someone, or something, but the doorway was empty. The hallway was empty. Only the cold remained. The second patient coded at 2:59 a.m. in a different wing. Adrian rushed there, stumbling through half-lit corridors as the building groaned around him, the walls creaking and trembling as if reacting to the presence moving within them. By the time he arrived, the nurses were already working, desperate and frantic. But Adrian knew before he even entered the room that their efforts were futile. The air held the same unnatural chill, the same oppressive weight. The patient's chest rose once, then fell. The monitor beeped once. And then silence. St. Mercy exhaled. Adrian stood there, numb, realizing he had witnessed the pattern unfold in real time. The deaths were not random. They were not medical anomalies. They were the result of something that moved through the hospital with purpose, choosing victims with a hunter's precision. Something that had once been locked behind a door, sealed away, forgotten by those who feared it too much to confront it. Something that had grown stronger in the dark. And now it knew he was watching. As he left the room, he felt the cold brush against his shoulder, like a fingertip tracing a warning across his skin. It was no longer hiding. No longer content to linger in shadows. Whatever lived inside St. Mercy had been feeding for 16 years, growing bolder with every soul it stole. The night shift staff might whisper, the administrators might bury the truth, the records might vanish, but the hospital itself remembered. The walls remembered. The dead remembered. And now, Adrian understood with chilling clarity that the thing haunting St. Mercy wasn't finished. It was patient. It was hungry. And it had begun to choose its next target with unmistakable precision. Him.